Great. All right. Well, we'll get started here briefly, as I know everyone is spending a little bit of their evening with us. My name is Annalise Hoke. I'm a principal city planner in community planning and development, and I'm joined here with my colleague, Brad.
Good evening. I'm Brad Weinig. Thank you also for joining us. I am the Director of Catalytic Partnerships for the Department of Housing Stability, or HOST, here at the city. I'm working hand in hand with Annalise and the CPD team on this exciting policy effort.
And if I can have our interpreter, Rosa, provide an introduction, and we'll start in interpretation and then get going with our evening.
Thank you so much. I'm hoping you all can hear me okay. I'm going to say this introduction, this language justice introduction, both English and Spanish. Good evening. My name is Rosa Guzman Snyder. I'm here with the Community Language Cooperative. This evening, the organizers of this event have made a commitment to language justice. What that means is that we'll be providing simultaneous interpretation into English and Spanish. In just a few minutes, as soon as the host turns on the feature, you're going to see a globe icon on the bottom of your screen. What we ask for you to do is to select the language that you would like to hear the presentation in tonight, whether that be English or Spanish. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Rosa Guzmán Snyder, estoy aquí con la Community Language Cooperative y esta noche los organizadores de este evento han hecho un compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje. Lo que eso significa es que esta noche vamos a estar proveyendo interpretación del inglés al español y el español al inglés. En unos minutitos van a ver un globo terráqueo que va a aparecer abajito de su pantalla y va a decir interpretación. Ustedes pueden seleccionar inglés o español. Vamos a encender la función de interpretación. Let's go ahead and turn on the interpretation feature.
Great. Thank you so much. Right. So before we get started with this evening, I'd like to introduce Councilwoman Amanda Sandoval to the meeting and just allow her to provide a few introductory remarks on this broader effort that she's been helping us work through over the past couple of years.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for helping me out. You think 2 years into Zoom that we figure out how to be a panelist and be the webinar. So thank you all for joining us this evening. And thank you, Annalise and Brad, for your commitment to this hard work. When I was running 3 years ago, one of the first things that I heard on the campaign trail was that Denver was not affordable and that we needed to do something about our affordable housing crisis that we're in. I believe that this solution is something that we have anxiously been waiting for in Denver, and I appreciate the response to the feedback that we have gotten so far, such as exempting ground floor active street use and other important updates that we have given to the feedback from the community we've heard. So with that, thank you for letting me have a moment of your time, and I'll be listening.
Thank you so much, Councilwoman. And once again, thank you all for coming and sharing your evening with us here tonight. So just in terms of what we have planned for about the next 90 minutes, we're going to provide you with a brief staff presentation to give you an overview and an understanding of what our proposal is. We're also going to use a tool that might be familiar to some of you called Menti, which allows us to interact with folks such as yourself and kind of see where the room is at in the Zoom room world that we're living in. We've also received some really thoughtful questions that folks have submitted to us either via email or through the registration form prior to our meeting this evening. So we'll run through some of those first, and then we'll also have time to use the Q&A box and ask folks to submit their questions that they would like to hear, as well as receive any feedback there. So just a couple of Zoom logistics. We already had a great introduction on that language access piece, but just as a quick reminder, at the bottom of your screen, you should see that globe for interpretation. Please select your language of choice, and that will allow you to participate in the meeting. The other piece too is please feel free as we're going along to submit your questions into Q&A. We'll go through the presentation before introducing those in, but please know that we have a full team of staff that are tracking and monitoring all those questions, so we can be sure to answer as many of those as we have tonight. Also, before we get started, we are going to use this Mentimeter tool. We just want to know a few questions about who's in the room and kind of what your thoughts are. And so if you're on a computer, you can go to menti.com and you're going to enter this 8-digit code that you see here on the screen and hit submit. Additionally, you can also do the same thing on your telephone if that's easier for you as well. Participation here is certainly not required, but it's encouraged, and it's just a way for us to interact with you in kind of our virtual world that is going forward. So since this is a new tool for some of you, we'll just pause really briefly to allow folks to go onto that Mentimeter screen. So menti.com, and you're going to enter this code. It's also important to note that these answers and responses are entirely anonymous. And so, please feel free to participate and do that. I'm gonna stop.
Annalise?
Yep.
Yeah, if you can just hold for 1 second, we're having trouble with the Mentimeter code. So we're gonna get that updated, and maybe you can keep going. We'll update everybody on what that code number is as soon as we can troubleshoot that.
Thank you. This is why you need a whole suite of tech folks trying to help make these things work seamlessly. I'm going to jump into then part of the presentation while we try to get that piece sorted out, and then we'll kind of jump back to those questions there, if that's all right. All right. Thank you, everyone, for kind of bearing with us. We're gonna jump into the presentation. Apologies about that, but we really want to get that interactivity working. So hopefully we can get that sorted out. But before we jump into what's going on with Denver today, and to fully understand Denver's current housing needs, it's really important that we look back and we look at how things changed. So we're going to go back in time, not too far, but to the early 2000s. And when we get there, Denver does look a little bit different. And with the housing costs and the incomes, they're also looking a bit different. In the year 2000, the median household income in Denver for a resident was about $40,000. And the average price of a home was $165,000. That equates to a mortgage of less than $1,000 a month. And if you are renting, your median rent was about $630 a month. Sounds pretty good, right? I would love those prices here today. And what that means, though, is that so many of the job types that you're thinking about in terms of our teachers and our firefighters and our restaurant workers, they had housing options and could afford to live in Denver. Also, if you looked around at the broader community in year 2000, you'd find that the majority of your peers were not housing cost burden. Housing cost burden is a term that we commonly use in the housing world when households are paying too much for the cost of living. Specifically, they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing. When folks aren't housing cost burden, they have enough money to pay for things like healthy food, healthcare, childcare, and transportation, all these important necessities. But now if we jump into 2020, 22 years later, things are looking a bit different. Right now in Denver, the median household income has increased pretty substantially. It's up to about $84,000 a year. However, concurrently, the median rent has gone up substantially to over $1,800 a month, and the home price is now more than $500,000. And so while our incomes have increased substantially over the past 22 years, home prices have increased even more dramatically. And as a result of these housing costs increasing at 2 times the rate of people's incomes, so many people that make our city a great place to live and who are critical to our community, whether it's teachers, food service workers, construction workers, and families, are really no longer able to afford the cost of living in Denver. I want to pause here to ask my tech team to see if we are able to get that Mentimeter operating and up and going where people can access it.
Yes, thank you, Annalise, for the pause.
Great.
The new code, it's in the chat and it's in the Q&A answers. And I'm going to say it now. If you go to menti.com, the new code is 65741746. You'll also see that at the top of the screen in front of you right now.
All right. Thank you all once again for your patience as you think you have things figured out 2 years in and there's still computer glitches. But as we see people figuring out that software and kind of coming in, while there is, a mix of responses that we're seeing, it's very notable that the vast majority of folks here on the call certainly think that Denver is getting too expensive. And just for quick context, it looks like we have about a third of our attendees using Mentimeter. We have about 73 attendees on the meeting here tonight. So once again, thank you for sharing your evening with us. And we'll continue to use this tool as we keep going, and we'll share out those results. All right, we'll let those keep coming in. I'm going to jump back over to the presentation here. And so for those of you that answered yes to that last question, you're certainly not alone. Today, we see many more households are spending far too much on the cost of housing. What that means is that today, 1 in 3 Denver households are cost burdened. That means that they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And of those, another 48,000 households are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. That means that all of those services like transportation, healthcare, childcare, and food are now a smaller portion of their budget, and they really can't thrive. And so they're having to make those difficult choices between paying their rent or sending their kid to childcare programs and other things like that. And of course, it's important to note that we've all seen these headlines, such as these, that have grown in frequency over the last decade. And so it's really important to know that while we've talked about how housing costs can negatively impact an individual and our spending, as city planners, we're also thinking about the future of Denver and the directions that we're headed. So what happens to our society when housing is unaffordable? What we see is that lower income individuals are often deprived of housing in areas with access to jobs, multimodal transportation, parks, and other amenities. And this can really further inequities. We also see that less money flows into the local economy as people are spending more of their income on housing or living in other locations. We also see economic growth slowing because employers can't find workers that can live where those jobs are. And lastly, we also see traffic and carbon emissions increase as public infrastructure's costs grow and workers are forced to locate further away from their jobs, or you have to live further away from your kids' school or their support networks. So of course that's bad for individuals, but it's also bad for our community and our economy. And so in order for Denver residents and our city as a whole to thrive, we need more housing options that don't break the bank. So you might be wondering, what is the city doing about this? It's important to note that the city of Denver already funds the construction of thousands of deeply affordable income restricted units, which benefit people who qualify for subsidized housing. Our strategic plan outlines strategies for the city-funded work and our work with nonprofit partners to provide housing for thousands of people and provide thousands of affordable home rentals in the next 5 years. These strategies focus on deeply affordable 3 or more bedroom units for families, as well as supportive housing. But we know that's not enough to meet our growing population's housing needs. We also need the housing market and the private development market to be a part of the solution. And so that's really where this project fits in, and it's why we're here today. We need to have a more comprehensive approach to ensure that Denver has housing for everyone, including our workers who are now priced out of renting or home ownership. And to accomplish this, we need developers to be a part of the solution. For Denver to prosper, everyday Denver workers like firefighters, waitstaff, preschool teachers, and construction workers, all the people who make our city great, need to be able to live here. And so that's really what the city is proposing. We are proposing a new requirement that would ensure that as new housing is built, new affordable housing is created too. And we're doing this through 3 primary tools. The first is a mandatory housing program, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the following slides. That has incentives associated to it to improve the creation of affordable housing. We're also proposing updates to an existing tool, which is our linkage fee, to increase the funding for affordable housing. So it's important to note that under this proposal, all new development would contribute to creating affordable housing. smaller residential developments would pay an increased linkage fee to fund the creation of affordable housing. This is because you can't have a quarter of a home that's affordable, and so they pay funds to create affordable housing. Also, new commercial developments like hotel, office, retail, and industrial would also pay an increased linkage fee. And this aligns with what other cities charge and better meets the needs and the scale that we see here in Denver. But the main piece of this proposal will apply to residential developments of 10 or more units, that middle column that you see here on the slide. State law changed last year to allow for cities across the state to create policies like these and ensure that affordable housing outcomes occur in all new developments. However, it's important to note that the state bill does have some standards, and these require things like alternative compliance and incentives. So that's also an important part of our proposal. So as we're creating this new tool to ensure that affordable housing is built and new housing is created along with it, what this does is it requires new developers of new housing that sell or rent a percent of their units to lower income residents. So what we have here is a new housing development. Under this new scheme, it would require that a portion or a percentage of those units are income restricted and affordable to many people in our workforce, and that produces mixed income housing. So let's talk a little bit more about what that would look like. So through this proposed tool, we'll need developers, like this example here, James, and we're going to illustrate this policy using James the developer as an example. So let's say James wants to build a rental apartment in Denver. He plans to build 200 rental units. And under the city's new proposal, James would have 3 options. The first 2 options are to build affordable units on site and deliver mixed income housing. It's important to note that these are the primary priorities that the city is trying to achieve, creating more affordable housing and creating mixed income affordable housing. That third, which is required by state law, is to pay a fee in lieu. And we'll walk through the examples of what each of those could look like. So in that first development option that the developer James has, he would need to create 8% of his units as affordable to households earning up to 60% area median income. For those of you wondering, that's about $50,000 a year for a 2-person household. Or for a family of 3, he could also provide those units for a family that's making up to $56,000 a year. You might be wondering, why is this kind of different income amounts based off of household size? And this is because AMI levels vary based on your household size. This slide here is telling us a lot, but the key takeaway is that AMI, or area median income, is a nationally used system, and this helps us determine whether or not a household is eligible to rent or to buy an income restricted house. AMI thresholds are adjusted by the number of people in the household, and it varies by location. So what the AMI in Denver is looks different than the AMI, say, in Fort Collins. The numbers on the screen here are the 2021 figures for Denver specifically. And as you can see, the AMI will vary by household size. Therefore, if there's a nurse who on their own is making $77,000, and they would be making then more than the area median income, or up to 120%. But if the nurse was living with another person, like a child or a partner who was unable to work, like an elderly parent, the income for the 2-person household would now be below the area median income. So jumping back to the developer options, that first one was to provide 8% of units to individuals earning up to 60% of the area median income. Instead of building 8%, he could instead build a greater percentage of units, now 12% of units affordable to households earning an effective average of about 70% area median income. For a 2-person household, that would mean that 24 of the units would need to be affordable to households earning an average of $63,000 a year. This means that some of these units could be affordable to the Smith family, who makes a slightly higher income with a family of 4, earning up to $79,000 a year. It also means, though, that in this scheme with an average, it could provide the gray couple with an affordable home if they make less than $31,000 a year. So this option 2, because it's an average, allows for those units to serve a broader range of lower, moderate wage individuals. We also know that we want to create more housing overall, as well as more affordable housing. And so in some areas of the city, James would be able to use that incentive to reduce permit fees, reduce parking, and build a slightly taller building. This would, in essence, increase the total number of units that he is able to create, and it also increases the number of affordable units being produced. Now, like I said before, this is a tool that was recently enabled via state law last year. And with it, though, there were some important caveats. It requires that there be an alternative to creating affordable housing on site. And this alternative in our policy, which is a best practice, is a fee in lieu. And these fees range from about $250,000 per affordable unit required to upwards of $478,000. Sorry, lots of numbers tonight, depending on where that unit is and whether it's rental or ownership. In this case of that 200 unit development, James would be required to pay $4 million to fund affordable housing in the city of Denver instead of building those homes on site. So we're going to pivot over to the mentee and ask you a couple more questions here. So the first one is, I think, something that we were wanting to kind of ask earlier on, but are you a friend or a family member struggling to afford housing in Denver? As those responses are coming in, I think what this really illuminates that even if we individually in this moment aren't struggling to afford housing, this is an issue that affects our community as a whole. Once again, reminding ourselves that 1 in 3 households in Denver are cost burdened, where they're spending too much of their income on housing and are simply just one missed paycheck or a car accident away from losing their home. And so this is really an issue that, that the city is really trying to tackle more holistically and bringing all of our tools to the table. Glad to also see a few more participants coming in and now having 45 folks participating in Mentee, so thank you. Kate, would you mind moving on to the next question that we have here? So now that you know a little bit about what we're proposing, which does require affordable housing to be a part of new development, we want to know, do you strongly agree or strongly disagree? And how this one works is it's kind of taking an average in real time of where people's responses are coming in. I'll give it just another moment until we're up to about that 45 participants that we saw last go round. All right, great. So it sounds like maybe the vast majority of folks strongly agree that this should be an outcome, or at least somewhat agree, as this is certainly a slider scale. So it's really exciting to know that this is a tool that the city is now seeking to deploy and create an outcome for. Kate, would you mind moving along to the next slide? Great. So like I said before, incentives are a way that we can ensure that we're creating more housing overall and more affordable housing. And so we want to know, should we be providing as a part of this package incentives to support the creation of affordable housing? The statement here says that state incentives should be provided to support the creation of more housing in Denver, including more affordable housing. On the left hand, strongly disagree. On the right hand side, strongly agree. And yes, to clarify, these incentives go to developers. And so they're things like reductions in permit fees, reductions in vehicle parking, and in some instances, additional height to create more units and more affordable units as well. Great. It's also important to just remind ourselves that creating affordable housing costs money. And so more of what the city can do to help facilitate that outcome is what we're trying to achieve through incentives. Well, we're back to that magic 48 participants, Kate. So if you don't mind, we'll move on to the next one. So this kind of last key question that we want is, should Denver do more to create affordable housing? So it's important to remember that this is one piece of the puzzle. It's an important tool and it's going to help us deliver on our commitment to creating more affordable housing in the city, but there's also more that we can continue to do. And so we just want to know generally or broadly, should Denver be doing more to create affordable housing? And I will just note that we're seeing a couple of questions come in both the chat and the Q&A. We're going to try to track those all as best we can, but the Q&A will be the easiest spot for us to ensure we're not missing any of those questions that we can get to towards the end of this presentation here in a few moments. All right. And I think we have two more questions that we would just kind of like to know who's in the room here today. So this question is, what best describes your interest in this project? You might all say, I'm wearing multiple hats tonight. We're just trying to understand kind of what best describes your interest in this project and kind of who's out here tonight. So we have development industry member who might be doing affordable or mixed income projects, development industry member who produces predominantly market rate, housing advocates, community members, city employees, or that other category as well. Great. Well, it's great to see a mix of folks engaging in this conversation here tonight. We really appreciate, once again, you coming out and learning a little bit more, but also being able to get some of your questions answered and provide us with some feedback. And we even have a few more participants joining, so thank you so much. And I think, Kate, our last question is, we kind of want to know, who are we reaching in Denver? So what Denver neighborhood do you live in? So this is one that you can just type on in. If you live outside of Denver, you can just say outside or the city that you live in. Great. So we have folks from Lowry, from 5 Points. The animation's going really excited. We got folks from East Colfax, Mayfair, Highlands, Cheeseman Park, Westwood, Lodo. I'm starting to get dizzy. Uptown, Ruby Hill, Spear, Westside, Montbello, Globeville, Capitol Hill, some folks outside in Aurora, Berkeley. I'm sure I'm missing a couple. Awesome. This is really great to see. With a citywide policy like this, we know that housing doesn't just affect one neighborhood or one particular council district, but it's really something that stretches across our city. And so it's great to see all the different neighborhoods represented here tonight. Velcro, Union Station, Platt Park, Washington Park. All right. Thank you. All right, Kate, I think those are the questions that we had, at least for the initial, just kind of getting a read of where things are at. So if that's all right, I'm going to share back my screen. And I just kind of want to remind everyone in terms of, just a summary of what this kind of proposal is. I know that we talked through a lot of numbers, and that's kind of the unfortunate inherent aspect of this is ensuring that we're having a portion of numbers, but we just want to give you a simple recap. This proposal is really creating more affordable housing options for our workforce, and it increases funding for our Denver's Affordable Housing Fund. and it has three main components. So the first one, if adopted, new residential developments of 10 or more units must designate 8 to 12% of their new units as affordable. And in higher cost areas like downtown or Cherry Creek, developers would need to make that a higher percentage of affordable units. We're also proposing a gradual increase to the linkage fee, which is a fee on other development types, and that goes into Denver's Affordable Housing Fund. And as a third piece of this, incentives such as flexible parking requirements, height incentives, or permit fee reductions are also an important part of this proposal. So in terms of what is next for the Expanding Housing Affordability proposal, we released a first draft of this in fall of last year. And we heard from a lot of great community groups and organizations about it and how we could make it better. And so what we released at the start of this month was a revised proposal that is in response to that feedback. We're asking for the community to not only participate in dialogues such as tonight, but to also weigh on the revised proposal through March 14th. After that period, we will move into what we call the legislative review process. And that includes public hearings before your city council members and planning board. And those will start in April and run through June. We anticipate that Denver City Council will be considering the proposal for adoption in early June of 2022. So with that, we're going to just remind everyone of sort of the Zoom logistics and how that works. Hopefully everyone is able to access this in their language of choice. But now we're going to kind of move into some of the questions that we've been hearing. So the best way to do that to make sure that we're not missing them is to use that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And then we will kind of start going through those. Anything that we're not able to go through tonight, we'll certainly try to follow up and make sure that those responses are found under our common questions of the website. Also, there's a couple of folks that are calling in tonight, and so if they're unable to use those features, we'll certainly leave additional time at the end for people to ask questions. As a reminder, if you're listening in, *9 enables you to raise your hand saying that you have a question, and you can use *6 to mute or unmute. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and fingers crossed we'll have fewer technology glitches coming out. And Laura Swartz within CPD is going to help us ask some of those questions tonight.
Thank you, Annalise. Is that everyone hearing me okay? Thumbs up from Annalise and Brad. Good. Okay. We've got a lot of questions coming into the Q&A box, so thank you guys for all of those. We've answered several of them. Ones that have quick answers, we've gone ahead and answered those in the Q&A box, and several others we've just been holding on to because we're going to go ahead and ask them now. So one of the major themes, what we're seeing with some of the questions in this Q&A box, is about the linkage fee. We've got some questions from JE, several other people about whether our linkage fees are too low, what Pier City linkage fees are, how it compares. So let's kind of chip away at this in a couple simple questions. Just let's start, and for everybody in the room, talk about what is a linkage fee and what does it do?
Yeah, so I'll start with that, Laura. So a linkage fee is a fee on new development that essentially is linking the impacts of that new development to the need for affordable housing. So for example, a new office building is built that is creating a demand for workers, and those workers have a demand for housing. And so the linkage fee is capturing that impact through funds, and that fee is then a part of the Affordable Housing Fund, which funds the creation of affordable housing in the city. I'll let you, do you want to remind us of some of those other questions? That was the first one of what is the linkage fee, but then there were some questions around how does it compare and where are we at, correct?
Yep, that's it. So Jay's question is, why is the linkage fee not being raised to align with peer cities? Denver's is woefully low.
Yeah, so great question. Denver's is really low when we look at peer cities. Right now, some of them are less than $1 and others are less than $2. And what we commonly see in our peer cities is that they're at least double, if not quadruple that. So part of this proposal is also to increase the linkage fees on new development to ensure that all new development is not only contributing to affordable housing, but it's being done in a meaningful way that better addresses our housing needs. So for example, that current fee is about $1.83 per square foot. What we're proposing is that that will, in some areas of the city, go up to $8 a square foot. So that's a substantial increase of where it is today, and that's going to be increased over the next 3 years and will certainly bring us much more in alignment with our peers.
Shannon had a similar question about what do we consider our peer cities? What are there similar linkage fees? And I think as we kind of re-hit on that, also something that would be helpful is just differentiating for people how the linkage fee is different from the fee in lieu that you talked about during the presentation.
So our peers are, certainly other cities that we're looking at, and there's no exact Denver out there, but we do look at cities like Seattle or Portland, Minneapolis, and Atlanta, as well as some communities in California. However, I wouldn't always use them as easy comparisons to Denver. But all of those are important comparisons. It's also important to note that not every city that we commonly use as a peer has a linkage fee. So that also sometimes narrows down the pool. But what we see is that their linkage fees range from anywhere from $3 a square foot upwards of $18 a square foot. That $18 high linkage fee, though, is in Boston. And Boston is pretty different from an economics perspective. And they've also had their linkage fee on the books for over 20 years. And so their market has been able to adjust and see that rising as well.
Tiana Patterson asked, what do we mean by a gradual increase of the linkage fee?
Yeah. So to switch the flip, if you will, immediately and go from say 66 cents to $7 a square foot is a substantial increase. And so what that means is that starting this year, in kind of third increments, it would be increased to about $2. And then the next year, it would be increased to $4. And then in 2024, it would go up to $7. It's a gradual increase to acknowledge that sometimes the development industry needs a little bit of time to adjust and respond to significant changes in costs or regulations. And so that is something that is part of the proposal currently.
Excuse me, let's shift gears for a moment here. Several people in the Q&A are asking versions of a question along the lines of why don't we just allow for more housing to be built? If we just build more housing in general, wouldn't that just be more affordable?
So we certainly need to be doing that. And that is part of the proposal, is using incentives to ensure that we're creating more housing overall. But we also know that over the past 20 years, we've created more than 100,000 new units in the city of Denver, but very few of those have actually been affordable. And what that tells us is that the market will not create affordability purely out of supply, which is why we need to be doing both, increasing the supply and also ensuring that we're mandating affordable housing outcomes.
So along those similar lines, there are several questions in the Q&A on how we arrived at 8% of units. Is that proportional to the percent of residents at a certain threshold? Could that threshold be higher? What was it that went into 8%?
I'm happy to dive in, Annalise, if you want a break from talking. Good evening, everybody. Again, Brad Weinig with Department of Housing Stability. So what went into all of the numbers that are proposed in these policy efforts, including the percentage required of affordable on-site, we spent a lot of time doing economic feasibility analysis with a trusted third-party independent firm who did a bunch of analysis, worked with a bunch of different developers, had conversations, and ran a number of different financial models. And what you see in terms of like that 8% of units on site is where we felt, based on that analysis, that we could ask from market rate development to include without tipping the scales of the financial feasibility of those developments into infeasible. It's important to keep in mind that with the linkage fee, with the affordable housing requirements, that if we ask too much, if we go too far, if the market is unable to deliver what we're asking, then we get zero, right? So 20% of 0 units is 0 units. And zero developments producing a fee that's twice as high as we're proposing on a linkage fee side is $0. And so it's really important that we scale this right, and we keep in mind the feasibility of it, because it's only as good as the market's ability to deliver on it, if that makes sense.
All right. This next question comes from an email that Susan B sent us earlier today. So this was one of the questions that she was asking as she was registering. She's expressing something a lot of people are feeling, and she had a couple of questions in there that asked, why does it feel like luxury apartments keep being built with no affordable apartments for singles or families? And then on top of that, requirements can feel particularly burdensome with incomes that have to be 2 to 3 times the cost of the apartment. Then you have additional fees for parking and trash and everything on top of that. How does this policy address or take any of those concerns into account?
Sure. Thank you, Susan, for the question. Thank you for joining us. That experience is exactly why we are here tonight talking about this policy effort, right? The market is delivering a lot of housing. We need more of it, but most of it is at levels that are unattainable to a large portion of our community. And so what this policy intends to do, along with the other funding sources and programs that my department host has to create more deeply affordable housing, right? The idea is that we need to create more housing that is calibrated to what people earn, right? And so the whole intent is that the units that are created, the affordable homes that are created through this program, will be restricted such that people at a certain income will not have to pay more than 30% of their income on their overall housing cost. And that includes, again, not just rent or your mortgage payment, but also other costs of living like utility costs and other fees that are assessed that are non-optional, right? And so the idea is that if we can keep your overall housing cost of 30% of your income, that allows for you to have a reasonable budget for the rest of your needs to live and thrive in our city. And so that's exactly what this policy is designed to do. It's important to note too that while we're excited about this policy effort, that development takes time and often 2 or 3 years or more. And so the units that are created via this policy program probably won't start showing up in the market until another 2 or 3 years from now. But I think once it's up and running, right, the goal is that this program through policies will allow us to really rapidly increase what we're able to produce in the form of units. And while I hesitate to put numbers to it because there's a lot of optionalities that Annalise talked through in the process, on-site options, fee and lieu options, on top of all the other externalities, like say a pandemic that have an impact one way or the other on our markets. We think that this program, once up and running, should generate several hundred units a year, in addition to what we hoped within my department to fund of north of 1,000 units per year. So it's a meaningful increase, but is by no means our only tool.
This next question comes from Kayla, and she asked, will there be homes from builders who for people who make around $65,000 a year? And related to that, what is the city doing to hold corporations accountable and have them provide lower rents? I can rephrase it because there's two questions in there. So let me know if you want to break it up.
Yeah, so I'm happy to answer that first question. So if we were to pull back up that AMI slide, households or individuals earning $65,000 a year is certainly within that income spectrum that these new tools and new affordable units created are going to serve. And that's, certainly at those 65 and below is especially where we know that the housing needs are the greatest and that there are fewer and fewer housing options. And so this is introducing new housing options to that income level, as well as to lower income levels and slightly higher income levels. The second piece of, why, maybe Laura, if you can rephrase it, but I think it was, why isn't the city holding some of these private developers accountable to providing lower rents or otherwise? And this is something that's a little bit of a nuance, but essentially, given state law, we actually in the state of Colorado have had a ban on rent control since the early 1980s. And so what that means is that the state nor the city can restrict rents on existing developments. And so that's a tool that is not available to us. What did change though last year at the state was to allow us to restrict rents on new development being created through this mandatory tool. And so what we're doing and trying to achieve is ensuring that as new development occurs, a portion of those homes are affordable and they remain affordable for the long term, for 99 years. And so that's really what we're doing within our tools that we have.
Thank you. We're going to shift gears here for a moment and start talking about some of the incentives that accompany the proposal. Brendan asked how this plan will work with our parking requirements, our existing parking requirements. So specifically areas like downtown, which does not have a parking minimum today, or areas near transit.
That's a great question, and since it's in the zoning world, I'll take it, Brad, even though I know you're very well tuned in all of these pieces. And so our code sets forth minimum parking requirements for vehicles and bikes as well. But those minimum vehicle parking requirements are context sensitive. And what that means is that in areas of like downtown, we don't require any parking, even though we sometimes still see it built. And in areas closer to transit, we require less parking, and areas that are more suburban in our city that are further out and have less transit and mobility options, they require slightly higher parking. And so that's a system that's already built into our code. We also have an existing parking alternative for deeply affordable units that's already built into our code. But in terms of what is this doing that's a little bit different, as part of the incentives, we're allowing for developers to provide a lower parking ratio for all of their units when they're producing mixed income housing. It's a reduction of about 0.5 parking spaces based off of what your existing requirements are. And so what that means is that areas close to transit, they'll be able to provide even fewer parking spaces because folks might not need to have a car and they might not want to add that cost, and they'd rather use the benefits and the opportunities of transit in their area. Whereas more suburban areas will still have a slightly higher requirement, but it'll still be a reduction of what it is today when they're providing those affordable units on site.
All right. Brad, anything to add on parking?
No,
I'm kidding. This next question about incentives is about our height incentives. If we could talk a little bit about how we arrived at the height incentives.
So as Brad was talking about earlier, this is a tool that is sort of bending the market or ensuring that the market gives us better outcomes than what we're getting today and producing really more affordable units. And so to create incentives, we wanted to ensure that those added value to developers so they would then choose the options and produce the outcomes that we want. And that would be more affordable housing units on site. And so we used, once again, financial feasibility to help us understand at what point did those incentives add value and become more attractive than not using the incentives. Additionally, though, it's important to note that this is going to change aspects of our zoning code, and any changes to our zoning code must be consistent with our adopted plans like Blueprint Denver, which is our land use and transportation plan. And that sets forth guidance around urban design, housing priorities, where we should be directing growth, and so forth. And so we also looked at it not just from a market-based perspective, but also what is the community's vision and what is our city vision around where we should be directing jobs and housing. And so that was also another important consideration, as well as also looking at our small area plans, or those of you that might have recently or are actively participating in what we call a neighborhood plan or a neighborhood planning initiative. So all of those factors, once again, were used to inform those building height increases that are proposed in strategic areas where we have good access to existing transit, where our plans direct us to create more housing and jobs, and where it makes sense.
All right, thank you. The question, oh, sorry, I just lost his name. The question from Pete W. How many units are being built today? And how many units would this realistically add?
Yeah, Pete, thanks. Again, I can speak from a kind of affordable housing and host perspective. I think I mentioned this earlier, but in our 5-year strategic plan, right, we've looked at our pipeline and the resources we have available to us at this moment, and have set ourselves a goal of generating 7,000 new affordable units that are income restricted over the next 5 years, which is a kind of ramp up of where we've been because we have new resources and new policy tools available to us. In the past, I would say historically our department has been able to generate maybe, and it wavers from year to year, but between 500 and 1,000 units per year of affordable housing. I don't know exactly what the numbers are of what Denver is producing writ large in housing. I know Annalise mentioned 100,000 units over the last 20 years, and so it's a small percentage of the overall housing stock that is kind of restricted affordable. The goal of this program is to kind of increase that percentage, but we have demand across the board that is still continuing to kind of outstrip supply, with the gaps being greatest the further down the income spectrum that we get. And so we're using policy tools like these to chip away at those challenges over time.
This is another question that kind of looks forward to what would happen if the proposal was adopted. And so this question is, will 30% of the AMI limit be the metric for rent caps, or will HUD guidelines apply? So I think that the question is related to how are you determining whether somebody qualifies at the certain AMI level and what percentage of their income can go towards that?
Right. Yeah. No. It's based on kind of the federal definitions that HUD certainly helps define, right? Which is again the rent caps and or the for sale prices on for sale homes that are affordable. Are calculated to be affordable and therefore no more than 30% of the gross income of the qualifying household that is living in that unit. And so it's intended, it's ratcheted based on different AMI level distinctions and family size, but it's designed to be calibrated just like our other existing affordable programs, the ones that the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority administers, like the low-income housing tax credit. We use the same methodology, capping those rents, but also allowing for tenant utility payments and other non-mandatory fees.
All right. There's a number of questions coming in about, will this adversely impact development in Denver? There are concerns, Maggie expressed it pretty well, of do you think multifamily developers will avoid building in Denver as a result of this policy? So I'm probably not going to ask every single one of the questions coming into the Q&A because there are a lot along the same theme. But if we could just talk for a minute a little bit about what went into coming up with this policy and what went into coming up with making sure that it's financially feasible for our development industry while meeting our housing needs.
Yeah. And if I can just start with the response to simply answer the question of will we not see developers developing housing in Denver, the answer is no. And the reason is because these numbers didn't come out of thin air, but they were very meticulously thought and vetted through a variety of analyses that Brad really spoke to early on, talking to peer cities, talking to the development industry to understand where is that tipping point in which we've asked too much and it will have adverse impacts, but where can we ask enough that it's successful and creates better outcomes by creating more affordable housing in the city of Denver. We also know that market rate housing is what the market is willing to pay. And so I think sometimes we hear folks saying, well, aren't they just going to pass on the cost to someone else? And what we traditionally see when we look at other peer cities that have recently adopted these outcomes is that other things adjust. So the land price commonly adjusts. Those have been steadily increasing. They might soften a little bit. You might see tenant finishes adjusting or lender expectations adjusting. And those are all factors that kind of build in terms of how development responds to regulatory changes. But to just reinforce that we do not believe, given kind of the analyses that we've done in the work to date, that this will drive developers out of Denver.
All right, thank you. This question comes from Janelle. I'm not sure if we know this answer yet, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway and dig into your brain, Brad. Her question is, what's the paperwork that's going to be required to qualify for affordable housing? Her reference here is that I guess something she's experienced maybe is that HUD has required 6 months of bank statements. What type of paperwork might people have to go through in order to get one of these units in the future?
That's a good question. And I probably don't have all the details. I've got a series of colleagues who are steeped in the kind of compliance requirements. I will say that knowing the scale of this, it's very important that we make this kind of as painless as possible for the households that we're trying to serve, right? And so I know that HUD often comes with very onerous restrictions and requirements in terms of applying. I think we're trying to do a HUD light version of that to ensure that we know enough about kind of your household that to know that your household is the qualified for the programs that we want to serve, and that we know enough about you to know that we got you into the right unit or the right program. And then the onus will be really on the kind of the property owners and landlords and property managers to report to hosts on an ongoing compliance basis. And we work with them to ensure that they're keeping the right files, that they're keeping the income qualified residents in income qualified units, and that there's not a kind of a mismanagement of the program. And so it's again designed to be as kind of painless as possible, but sufficient enough to know that we're solving for the populations that we're trying to solve for and housing the folks that we really want to house through these programs. I can and in our Q&A, I'll try to follow up on the website as we post these things with more detail that's probably more eloquent for my compliance colleagues who can speak more specifically to how that works.
Thank you, Brad. All right, this question comes from Robert. It's a lengthy question, so I am going to paraphrase a little bit here, but he'd like to know about when a project does want to take advantage of one of these incentives. So they do want to have a reduced permit fee, reduced parking, or build slightly taller. What happens then in terms of zoning? Is there a formal zoning change process? Is there an opportunity for anyone to be involved in that, or is that already handled as part of this policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our zoning code is pretty dynamic as it currently exists, meaning that we have flexibility and standards that can occur without the need for rezoning or a change in public process. And so to ensure that these incentives add value and really streamline the production of affordable housing, they are built into the code. And you can see kind of those detailed changes in the public review draft for the Denver zoning code. And so what that means is that at the time of kind of site development plan, when the developer is submitting, they will say, yes, I am going to provide more affordable units than what would otherwise be required. And therefore, in exchange for that, I'm going to plan to use these incentives. And that goes through our standard city process of review and approval, which doesn't include public processes. That being said, if they wanted to pursue something that extended beyond what those standard incentives were, and they wanted a substantial height increase or other things, that might then require either a variance or a rezoning case. But what we're wanting to do is to ensure that these small modifications can be streamlined and benefit those projects and benefit the production of affordable housing. It's also important to note that these incentives are designed for fully affordable projects as well that are already doing the outcome and the work that we want, but we know that they're getting slowed down, whether it's in the permitting process. We've now created a new affordable housing review team to really provide dedicated staff to ensure that they're successful and able to quickly move through that permitting process and deliver units that much faster. And so we want to ensure that we're reducing barriers and slowdowns to creating affordable housing. And so that's why it's structured that way in the draft proposal.
All right, this question from Shannon. I am gonna read. She says she appreciates that we have amended the proposal to be an average of 70% AMI. So when Annalise was presenting, I don't know if when you presented option 2, you shared or not, that is a change that was made in response to recent feedback from the first round of public review on the proposal. However, she says this does still seem to be a choice on part of the developer instead of requiring a certain number of units at deep affordability. She's looking at some policies in peer cities, which she has stated, say like in LA, that require deeper levels of affordability, more units at deeper levels of affordability and fewer units at higher levels of affordability. And she kind of wants to understand what it is with the approach that we're doing in Denver and why we're not doing something similar to what they have in LA.
Yeah, love when folks do their homework, and LA is a really interesting case study. I think some of them do have to be down at 30%, and then a couple are at higher AMIs. And this is really, a policy balance that we were trying to decide. Given, once again, that feasibility word, but given where kind of the numbers were at, we could have forced a percentage of units at lower AMIs to be produced, but then that would mean that we're producing very, very few units. And so what we felt was that it was more productive for the market to focus on a higher generation of units in some of these areas while having the flexibility to serve lower incomes. We also have the ability to kind of negotiate an alternative in which we can kind of bring more to the table to ensure that we're reaching lower AMI levels. I think the other important piece to note is that we also want to set up these residents for success. And so sometimes folks that are earning less than 30% of the area median income might need additional support services, and those aren't going to be part of a traditional market rate development. And so part of it is also making sure that we're setting up our residents to be successful in that housing option.
Thank you, Annalise. Pete's question here, this is pretty simple and straightforward. Why doesn't the city just build and run the housing that we need?
A simple question with perhaps a slightly more complicated answer, but I'll give a couple of legal reasons, and I think there's also a more important, perhaps practical one. So a couple of legal reasons. The state law kind of dictates that municipalities can't kind of operate and manage housing properties. That has to be done by our peers and public housing authorities, like in our case, the Denver Housing Authority. Secondly, in order to make sense of development, you have to be able to leverage money and borrow capital from banks, from lenders and resources to make economic sense of developments. And jurisdictions in Colorado are not able to borrow long-term dollars without a vote or approval of the people. And so those are kind of two functional challenges. The reality, though, and equally importantly and practical, is just that we wouldn't be that good at it, right? There are a number of for-profit and nonprofit and housing authority groups that are experts in creating and building and maintaining and managing housing, and that's not really the most effective use of staff and city resources, right? We'd rather use our dollars to support those actors and use a combination of policy tools, carrots and sticks, if you will, and dollars to kind of facilitate the outcomes that we want to see and work on the policy solutions instead.
Question now, and then I do want to take some time and pause if anybody's on the phone to let them unmute and ask their questions at that point. So let's do one more question first. This question is, how do we increase new for sale housing? A lot of the perception is that what's entering the market right now is just rental housing. And so what is this policy thinking about in terms of making sure we're getting both for sale and rental housing within what this policy can control?
Yeah. Certainly. And I would say that is a fair statement. Proportionally speaking, Denver is producing substantially more rental units than ownership units. And that is in response to a variety of factors of challenges of creating ownership, but also responding to what the market demand is. And so while we can't require units to be ownership and not rental, we can ensure that we're not creating additional burdens through this policy that limit or slow the production of ownership housing. And so this is something that we actually made a change to based off of feedback and the revised proposal. But previously we were requiring a higher proportion of ownership units to be income restricted. However, in a lot of great follow-up conversations, we wanted to ensure that we weren't, overly burdening ownership as compared to rental. And so we made a revision to ensure that those were kind of at a more similar alignment, and in the hopes that that will spur and continue opportunities for ownership to be built. That being said, we know that there's still more work to do, and that's where it's important that we move this piece of the puzzle while supporting other actions to enable those opportunities in the city.
Great, thank you. All right, let's pause for a moment on the questions. If you are on the phone and you have a question, press *6 to unmute yourself, say hello, And if we have multiple people doing it at once, we'll just ask some people to try to take a step back for a moment.
Laura, I'm only seeing one call-in phone number too, so
Okay,
they
Then
might
we
just
will-
be here to listen. But
all right, then we will keep moving along. All right, our next question in the Q&A comes from Robert. And this, I'm going to read it exactly as it was written. Does this policy ask anything of people in unsustainable $1 million single-family homes? Or is the buck going to continue to get passed to people who live in the most sustainable buildings? I realize there's a lot in that question that we can unpack, but I would like to kind of talk about how does this policy include single-family homes, duplexes, a lot of your lower density residential?
yeah, it's an important question. And I think sometimes we wonder, are we all being a part of the solution, or are only some of us being part of the solution? So it's a great question to ask. And this is where some of our changes to the linkage fee, which apply to kind of those smaller single unit developments, we are proposing kind of a new system where right now, regardless of how big your home is, you're just going to pay a standard fee of 66 cents a square foot. So not very much. What we're proposing is that larger homes are going to be paying not only a higher fee per square foot, but then in effect a higher fee overall. And so when those large homes are created in the city of Denver, they're going to be contributing much more substantially to affordable housing funding and creation than some of those smaller, more attainable homes being created in the city. The other piece that I think is also important to note is that the linkage fee is only one of many funding sources in the city. It's a really important one, and it's one that we want to be doing more with, but it's not the only one. We also all pay property taxes if we own our homes. And so property taxes are based off of valuation, and a portion of those do go to fund affordable housing. And so those larger homes are also going to be paying more in terms of property taxes. But Laura, please let me know if I missed something in that question, as there was a lot of important pieces there.
I think you nailed it. This next question comes from Pete. What do we think the number of affordable units is we need a year?
More than we're able to produce now, or frankly, even with these policies to be able to produce, although it's important that we make incremental progress, I should say, all along. So the background analysis that we've done, and again, you can see, some of these resource analysis both on my department's website, denvergov.org/housing, or the landing site for this particular program, denvergov.org/affordability incentive, and there's a background report in there. But effectively, kind of at the 60% AMI rental level, 80% AMI for sale level and below, we're short, tens of thousands of units. I believe it's somewhere in the kind of 30 to 50,000 unit range that we have a gap. And so, we're not going to be able to make that up overnight, or really even over, the course of the next few years. But it doesn't mean that we can't try to set goals and create policies and resources towards trying to overcome those challenges over time. And so that's very much what our kind of 5-year strategic plan that my department just posted and finalized last year really goes to try to address. And so, we're not going to solve it in the next decade, but we certainly can do a lot more than we're doing now. And that's really what we're here to talk about.
Thank you. All right, our next question is from Sarah. This is an interesting one I haven't actually heard asked before. Will there be any incentive for already developed housing structures to convert some of their units into affordable units?
Yes, great question. So that is, although Annalise mentioned, right, we don't have the legal ability to kind of mandate rent control across existing units. What we can do is provide resources and invest capital into properties to both kind of rehabilitate them, and in the process, right, record restrictive covenants on some of the units. And so I have colleagues that are dedicated to doing exactly that, and we call that kind of affordable housing preservation. And our goals, moving forward are to preserve about 250 units this year and each year moving forward through mechanisms just like that, right? Where we put capital in and in exchange are able to record restrictive covenants on some percentage of the units, both in terms of existing affordable properties that are running up against the end of their restrictive covenant periods, as well as what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, or properties that are unrestricted, but are certainly vulnerable to being purchased, redeveloped, or even scraped, right? And so we want to do is preserve not necessarily the buildings themselves, but to invest in them, upgrade them, and preserve what affordability exists. And so that is also very much a top priority for my department.
We've also got a couple questions here along the lines of the community engagement work you guys have been doing for the past year. So I'm going to ask both questions and kind of asking the same thing. One is, what are the efforts going into educating the general public, community beyond tonight, about affordable housing being built through this proposal? And what kind of feedback or input was sought from community organizations as we were developing this policy?
Happy to take that one. So the first piece is, what is being done to educate or make folks aware with any outreach effort, especially one that's impacting the entire city and on something that's so important. We really have to take a multi-pronged approach. And so that means that we're doing a lot of different things to try to meet people where they're at. So a lot of that is offering to go and meet with groups in their monthly RNO meetings, or community organizations, or industry organizations, or business districts. All of those existing organizations are folks that we really sought to reach out to, connect with, and have conversations with, to one, educate them about what the city is considering and proposing, and two, to get their ideas and feedback on how this can be a better outcome, a stronger proposal, and create more affordable housing in Denver. So that was one thing that we did a lot of. We also have a great communications team that Laura heads up, as well as folks in host as well. And their job is to try to spread the word through as many mechanisms as possible. So that's through newsletter blasts, social media, and other things, as well as maybe you've heard about it from stories in the news as well. We're also connecting with decision makers, so our city council leaders. We've been meeting with them regularly throughout the duration of that, and those meetings are all open to the public and televised on Channel 8, as well as our planning board, and then hosting events like these, in which we have the opportunity to provide overviews, ask questions. And the last one that I would certainly encourage folks to participate in, knowing that we would love to get to have an even more informal dialogue than what we're having tonight, which is unfortunately more structured, just given the reality of the virtual world that we live in. But those are office hours. And what it means is that it's really just an opportunity for you guys to informally talk to Brad and myself and some other folks on our team about what ideas, questions, feedback you have. And so those are actually some of my favorite, because it just allows us to have some really awesome conversations with people who are really clearly passionate about this topic, as they should be.
I think it's important to note too, and I think I saw Jenna maybe put it into the chat, but we also do have a kind of pretty robust summary and record of all the different organizations and community outreach efforts that we've gone through so far. And I hope that those of you who have participated thus far, and thank you, see that we are taking your feedback seriously. We are considering as much as we can and trying to make adjustments where we think we can. And if we can't, for whatever reason, or we're not going to, be trying to kind of provide replies and justify why we weren't able to make that adjustment or weren't able to meet that request. And so it's not going into a black box. We do look at it, we do hear it, we do take it into account, and we do have robust discussions about it. So keep it coming.
This next question is about the Affordable Housing Fund. So if we could talk a little bit about what it is, just a level set for everybody on the call. And then the question specifically is, how are these dollars being used? Is there a way that people can know where the dollars are going?
Sure. So the Affordable Housing Fund is one of a handful of other sources that might have of money that my department has access to in order to kind of put together our collective budget and resources and strategies for the next year. The Affordable Housing Fund in particular is where the linkage fee dollars flow into. Linkage fee dollars, again, as Annalise mentioned, do have to have a legal nexus. They are required and limited to be utilized for the creation to increase the supply of affordable housing below 80% AMI all the way down to kind of 0% AMI. And so we do use those dollars directly to invest, oftentimes in partnership with, say, a low-income housing tax credit development or a community land trust who is creating new affordable for sale properties. We're able to use those dollars to invest in those programs and kind of get them to economic financial feasibility. In addition to the Affordable Housing Fund, we have funds like the Homelessness Resolution Fund, right, that was passed. I believe our Fund 2B, if those of you who remember who were voters here in Denver, passed a couple of years back, that really is a critical source for everything we do around our homeless neighbors and working to get them housed and get them with wraparound services that they need. And so we have a number of different sources. Again, this is an important one. Linkage fee is absolutely crucial. We need more of it. It's great because it's locally generated and we can kind of design it as we need to respond to the market, but it isn't our only resource. We need a lot of different resources because we have a lot of different housing challenges to try to overcome.
This next question is one that I know we've already answered, but we're still getting a couple people who are asking about it in different ways. So I'm wondering if we try to answer it again, but maybe a little differently this time. The question is, if developers would choose the linkage fee. And so I want to hit on that because that's not a choice. That's determined by the type of what you're developing, not whether or not you would choose to do the linkage fee. Right. And then the question is, if that's the case, would affordable housing be developed further and further away from important city nodes, considering land costs and budgets?
Yeah, I'm trying to answer that. So again, I think, and sometimes there may be a conflation between linkage fees and then the fee in lieu option, right? So linkage fees, to your point, is not a choice. That is just by nature of what the development is, right? And if it's a non-residential development or a residential development of under 10 units, they would pay, thank you for putting the slide up on Elise, the linkage fee. The fee in lieu dollars are an option that the developer applicant has in lieu of providing units on site. And those, I should mention, are calibrated. They are high, right? They're the intent, again, with that feasibility analysis that we went to great lengths to do with third-party feasibility economic professional firms, is designed to be, less enticing than providing the units on site. But as Annalise mentioned, we do have to provide options. And we do have uses for those dollars when they do come in. And so the intent of this program is to do the exact opposite of what I forget the name of the individual who asked the question, but who he or she asked, which is, we're trying to ensure that affordable housing options are created throughout the city and in every neighborhood and every community as much as we can through these policy tools, right? And so this is designed to kind of, again, create a steady, modest flow of moderately affordable housing throughout the city and not necessarily concentrated in any one neighborhood or any one building.
And if I can just add to that overview, I think what we've seen in peer cities is that I'm actually not going to answer that. Sorry.
I was reading questions. Did you want me to move to another question, or you're just choking? Okay. While Annalise recovers for a moment, we will ask the next question. This one comes from Mia. I apologize if I'm saying it wrong. Are land conservancies or trusts able to provide any increased options for affordable housing so that our numbers can be scaled up?
Yes, I mean, the resources that we have available through the Affordable Housing Fund, otherwise, we do support community land trusts in their creation and preservation of affordable for sale units through their models. They're incredibly important partners of ours and a big part of our kind of strategic plan moving forward. And so the short answer is yes, absolutely. They're very much a part of the solution. And in those developments, right, they are also eligible to access the incentives that Annalise, talked about, to the extent that they are helpful in generating more affordability through their programs.
Annalise, have you recovered? Yes. Okay, we're good. We've got a couple of different versions of this question. But what is the impact of this policy on single family housing? Whether it's zoning, linkage fee, what is their role in this policy?
So single family housing currently pays a very modest fee through the linkage fee. Under this proposal, they will now pay a substantially increased linkage fee to fund affordable housing in a much more meaningful way than they are today. And like we were referencing earlier, larger homes, they're going to be paying an even higher linkage fee. And so that is the mechanism in which single unit developments and 2-unit developments and smaller residential developments up to 9 units will contribute to affordable housing through this.
And I'll add too, Annalise, that already one of the sources of money that goes into our affordable housing fund as well is as a kind of allotment from property taxes. And so I know the city just recently mailed out your property tax bills for those of you who are fortunate enough to own a home. You'll see on your bill, if you look at it, the itemized list, there's an affordable housing fund contribution. And so everybody that pays property taxes, including single family homes, primarily are also, contributing towards the broader affordable housing fund and the goals of our strategic plan.
Thank you guys both. This last question is from me, but I would like to make sure everyone here has a chance to follow up and continue participating in this project. So what is next? If your question wasn't answered tonight, where can you comment on the proposal? Where can you learn more? Where can you find answers to these questions?
Great, thank you. And I'm going to share our screen too, just to remind everyone. I think it's been popped in the chat a few times. Our project website is denvergov.org/affordability incentive. So first of all, thank you for coming out tonight and giving us your questions and comments. We're tracking all of those. Apologies if we weren't able to get to your specific question tonight. But on that project website, there's a couple of different ways in which you can provide further feedback or ask additional questions. The first is going to be a comment form in which you can submit comments to us. You can also take a survey. It's pretty high level, but we certainly would appreciate that, and it only takes a few moments. You can also always shoot us an email, but also participate in some of those office hours. We would love to have further dialogue and conversation with you. And lastly, you can always share your feedback with your city council members, as they will be making the final votes and determinations on this in June. They probably want to hear from you. So we encourage all of those different mechanisms as we continue the conversation over the next couple of weeks and moving into that adoption process. All right, great. All right, well, that was a lot of information. I know that there's a lot to digest here, and there's a lot of complexity, and housing is not an easy solution, and this is just one piece of the puzzle, but we believe it's a really important piece of the puzzle for the city of Denver to be advancing. And so I just really want to thank you for spending your evening with us tonight. I know that many folks probably would rather be eating dinner or spending time with their friends or their kids or family. And so just want to sincerely thank you for providing us with your evening tonight. We will certainly be following up and updating our common questions section on the website for these, as it's very likely that the questions that you're wondering and asking are curious for other folks. And so we want to make sure that those are answered. And we certainly encourage you to follow up and continue the conversation with both us as well as your neighbors, your community members, your family members. Help us spread the word so we can ensure that this proposal is strong and works for a better Denver. So with that, I'm happy to wrap up a little bit early, Laura, unless there was any last minute questions that came in that would be helpful for us to address. But otherwise, I'm happy to let everyone have 5 minutes back to their evening.
We are getting several comments from people just saying thank you and that they appreciate the presentation.
I'll add my thanks to all of our participants, and thank you, Laura, for helping us facilitate the Q&A. Rosa, very much for your translation services, and all of our other teammates and staff that are kind of working behind the scenes in the black screens to help keep this thing running along smoothly. It takes a village sometimes. So thank you all. Enjoy your evening.
Yep. We'll be posting a recording of this online for folks that maybe couldn't watch it tonight, or if you want to share this with your colleague, you can certainly fast forward to what parts are helpful to you, as well as just sending out a reminder of kind of where some of those links are on the website as well. So we certainly appreciate your time, and please don't hesitate to reach out and continue the conversation with us. Thank you.